Late one August night in 1991, gunmen entered this Buddhist temple and murdered everyone inside.
It was horrific.
It was just surreal and very, very silent.
It was the worst mass murder in Arizona history. The murders were carried out with military-type precision. There was no clear explanation as to why someone would murder the monks, who were unarmed, had no known enemies, and shunned all types of violence. The Ku Klux Klan, the Bloods street gang, and even some temple members were suspects. The investigation had more twists, turns, and surprises than most others. And some of the techniques used by local law enforcement drew criticism.
It was their ignorance combined with their overzealousness in this case that surprised me.
It was a story of international proportions.
It was a zoo. It was just a zoo.
On the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, a group of Thai Buddhist monks built a tree-lined oasis, a place where they could quietly practice their religious beliefs. The temple, called Wat Pram Kunaram, was not particularly well known to Phoenix residents.
It was very modest, but the people were very dedicated, and they were very good people, very kind, good people that were good citizens here in Maricopa County.
Dressed in their traditional orange robes, the small community of monks kept to themselves, tended to their gardens and their animals.
These are very docile, very quiet, very peace-loving people, and they're not out making big waves in the community.
These were the type of people that, as one story goes from the temple, that these monks wouldn't even swat flies when they were stinging them.
Their worship services were open to the public, attended mostly by Buddhists of Thai ancestry who lived in the area.
It was a place not only probably of religious worship, but also cultural as well. It's a gathering point for the Thai community here in Phoenix.
It was a custom for members of the community to donate food to the monks. On Saturday morning, August 10th, a temple member was dropping off some food when she noticed some blood on the door. Inside, in the living room, she found the monks lying on the floor as if sleeping. But they weren't sleeping at all. All 9 residents of the temple were dead. It appeared the victims had been herded into the living room, placed in a circle, ordered to clasp their hands behind their heads, and were then shot, execution style, one by one. 6 of the victims were Buddhist monks. One was a 16-year-old monk in training. Another was a temple helper. The 9th victim was a 71-year-old Buddhist nun. It was the worst mass murder in Arizona history. Russ Kimball supervised the 66-person task force assigned to investigate the murders.
It looked very similar to what you would see of the mass assassinations in Vietnam, actually, with the people laying face down, their hands clasped behind their heads. It was just surreal and very, very silent.
Investigators videotaped and photographed the crime scene carefully. On the floor were shell casings from 2 different weapons. One was from a .22 caliber firearm, the other a 20-gauge shotgun. Bedrooms had been ransacked and some electronic components were missing, but other valuables were left behind. A money tree was in plain view with cash attached, and a nearby safe was untouched. Crime scene technicians meticulously dusted the walls, windows, and furniture for fingerprints and found over 1,000 prints. but all were matched to either residents of the temple or employees and volunteers. On the walls were smudge prints. Tests revealed the marks were made with cloth gloves, which showed experience and premeditation.
They leave so little evidence there. It definitely shows that this was a well-planned, very calculated crime that was to occur.
On the hallway floor was fire extinguisher residue and clear footwear impressions. They did not belong to the monks, since their religion prohibits shoes in the temple. Lifting the impressions was done with an electrostatic charge and a sheet of mylar.
You place one electrode alongside, and the other electrode, you touch the metallized surface of the mylar film, and the static charge draws the mylar down against the surface. And again, static electricity collects all that dust, and you can then see a reverse image of the print that you saw on the linoleum.
The impressions were from a military-style boot with soles designed for use in the snow. Near the bodies, carved into the wall with a knife in letters 2.5 feet high, was a message from the killer. It was the word Bloods, the name of a well-known street gang.
It immediately made us begin to speculate that maybe this was a gang murder in some way. Motive wasn't able to be determined at that time.
A few miles away, spray-painted on a water tower, was the Phoenix Group Strikes Again. It was a group police had never heard of, and it was unclear whether the message was related to the murders. Since most of the victims were Asian, some speculated it was a hate crime. A Thai newspaper reported that one of the murdered monks told his superiors a month earlier that they had received threats from the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group. He also told his superiors that he had clashed with another monk who had since left the area. Thailand's U.S. ambassador flew to Phoenix looking for answers. He was also fearful that the monks would close the temple.
A temple without monks would be no longer a temple. So the monks informed me that they determined to restaff the temple.
Politicians pressured local law enforcement to solve the crime and to do it quickly.
We need to get to the bottom of it in a hurry. It's just a horrible crime, and it's the kind of thing that is so shocking. I'm at loss for words, frankly.
The government of Thailand officially asked the United States to use all means possible to find the perpetrators. Even the FBI got involved. Since Luke Air Force Base is located near the temple, it is often photographed by intelligence-gathering satellites. Sheriffs hope that a surveillance satellite may have photographed the getaway vehicle. Satellite photography is so advanced that it was possible a photograph from space could show the make and model of any vehicles in the vicinity. But there were no satellites taking surveillance photographs at the time of the murders. Brett Whiting is a reporter for the Arizona Republic newspaper.
And at this time, Russian technology was being made available, and backwater inquiries were made to determine if the Russians, in fact, had spy satellite photos that would be useful. However, it was determined that the Russians were not taking photos that evening with their satellite.
Deputies set up a tip line, and soon, with the international publicity, came hundreds of outside calls. One caller, an expert in Asian gang activity, said that the murders were most likely gang-related and believed he knew the motive.
He instructed us that they'd had a lot of home invasion-style robberies, and that we should consider the fact that a lot of the Thai Buddhists were smuggling gold into the country.
But there was no evidence this was the case here. Investigators also found a note on the temple's dining room table.
The note read something to the effect of already weighed 1,083 pounds or 1,083 pounds. In July of that year, there was 1,080 pounds of heroin on a barge, I believe in Oakland Harbor, that was followed to a warehouse and never picked up.
But further investigation revealed the true meaning of this notation.
The number correlated with a number of aluminum cans that had been gathered by people at the temple in some type of fundraising venture, and that was a lead that fizzled as well.
Also found in the temple were several Buddha statues lined up in one of the monks' bedrooms.
Before the murders, an Asian was caught, I believe, by the Canadian authorities bringing into the country a statue of Buddha that was filled with heroin.
Drug-sniffing dogs searched the temple.
And one of the dogs had a positive reaction inside the main sanctuary in an area of the carpet in front of where the monks sat during their ceremonies. And then the dog had a hit in a file cabinet in one of the bedrooms or the office, I believe. The second dog was brought in and reacted or hit in the same two places. We cut up the carpet. We looked everywhere, did not find any sign of narcotics at all.
Several sex magazines were in the bottom drawer of one of the monks' bedrooms. This prompted investigators to question employees and temple members, suspecting that jealousy or an angry spouse may have been the cause.
Even though these were holy men, they were human beings and they were men, we had wondered, it crossed our mind if somebody had been having an affair with one of the parishioners.
In a search for suspects, police videotaped the funeral service held at the temple. Sometimes killers will revisit the crime scene to relive the experience, but it turned up nothing. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit released a psychological profile of the lead killer, predicting the person was extremely unstable, ruthless, and depraved. The profile wasn't news to many in Phoenix. After following up on hundreds of leads, a telephone call provided the first real break in the case. It was from a mental patient who seemed to know intimate details of the crime. After the 9 execution-style murders in a Buddhist temple in Phoenix, Arizona, the Buddhist community, in keeping with their beliefs, mourned their loss, but also prepared to be united again.
To be sad is natural, but this is not the end of your life. You die here. As long as you have your desire to be, then you will continue.
Carved in a wall inside the temple near the bodies was the name of a well-known street gang, Bloods. Police wanted to keep this detail of the crime scene secret from the public, so they literally cut that section out of the wall, put it in a crate, and shipped it to the crime lab. For the most part, the crime scene revealed that these murders were carefully planned and expertly executed. But there were a few indications that the perpetrators might be juveniles. A fire extinguisher was discharged in the hallway for no apparent reason. Many of the rooms were ransacked, and a soda had been poured into the monk's computer, all signs of juvenile criminal behavior. 1 month after the murders, investigators got their first real break. Mike McGraw, a mental patient from a psychiatric hospital 120 miles away, called police to say he could lead them to the killers. McGraw admitted that he had been the lookout man and had driven the getaway vehicle on the night of the murders, and said he was outside the temple when the crime took place. He said the motive was robbery, not murder. McGraw said he heard several shots before the shooters ran out of the temple and took off. At first, police were skeptical, but McGraw knew an important detail about the crime, a fact that had been withheld from the public.
He said the word Bloods was carved in the wall. And that was significant because the word Bloods had been carved in the wall and had been protected, crated, and hauled out of the temple. So nobody knew except the investigators who were inside the temple.
Detectives weren't troubled by the fact that McGraw was a mental patient, recently hospitalized after a suicide attempt.
Mike McGraw said that there was a good reason, why he was in that mental institution, and that was because he said that he had so much guilt from the horrific crime itself.
So I was positive, absolutely positive, that we had at least one of the suspects.
And McGraw gave police the names of his 4 accomplices. One was his cousin, Mark Nunez. The others were Leo Bruce, Victor Zarate, and Dante Parker. Dante Parker was the only one with a prior criminal record, with arrests and convictions for theft and burglary. All were living in Tucson.
Immediately, SWAT teams wearing masks conducted full-scale raids and operations to take these boys into custody.
Police drove maniacally from Phoenix to Tucson, busted down doors, threw these people on the floor without explanation late at night, handcuffed them, threw them back into the car, and hauled them down to the police station to interrogate them.
Just to make sure, police asked Mike McGraw to pick these suspects out of a lineup, which he did. During Dante Parker's interrogation, he insisted he had never met the other suspects, had never before been in Phoenix, and said he was innocent.
He denied any involvement. Over the first 14 hours, the investigators and interrogators had given Dante bits and pieces of the story that they knew, namely how the monks had been shot.
Experts call this contaminating the witness, and that means anything the witness says afterwards is suspect.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of a circumstance in which it would be appropriate, because it contaminates the suspect, and it means that if they are innocent and made the false confession, you'll never know.
Parker held to his story throughout the first interrogation. Leo Bruce, a distant friend of Mike McGraw's, also denied any involvement.
And the interrogation went on for many, many, many hours.
Mark Nunez and Victor Zarate both maintained their innocence as well.
They never had any evidence that could remotely tie the Tucson defendants to this murder. They didn't have one single little bitty thread of evidence. Not then, not now, not ever.
The only thing that tied them to the crime was Mike McGraw's confession. In an effort to gather more evidence, Bill Morris of the State Police Crime Lab examined the .22 caliber shell casings found at the murder scene. He immediately recognized the murder weapon.
It narrowed it down to rifles that were made by the Marlin Firearms Company under the name of Marlin, Glenfield, and then a couple of others. The problem is there are a lot of Marlins in existence.
And some unusual marks on the casings helped to identify the model.
We noticed that there was a bulge around the firing pin that was put there as a manufacturing process, and it is only found on the semi-automatic firearms.
The Marlin Company had only been manufacturing those rifles for 3 years, which meant the murder weapon was relatively new. So detectives searched every pawn shop and used gun store in the area, confiscating all Marlin .22 caliber semi-automatic rifles made in the last 3 years.
We knew that we were going to find that weapon, and the way to find it was seize everyone we could find.
Hundreds were seized and test-fired, but none matched the murder weapon. With no hard evidence against the suspects, investigators decided to interrogate them once more. All had been identified by Mike McGraw, the mental patient from Tucson, who said he was the lookout man and driver of the getaway car.
When I say he was mentally ill and mentally disturbed, he was mentally ill and mentally disturbed. McGraw would have confessed to the Holocaust.
The Maricopa County Sheriff's Department was convinced that they had solved the mystery of the Buddhist monk massacre, the worst mass murder in Arizona history. Mike McGraw was the first to turn himself in, admitting he had driven the getaway vehicle at the murders. McGraw identified his accomplices: Dante Parker, Mark Nunez, Victor Zarate, and Leo Bruce. Initially, all 4 men denied any involvement. They were interviewed a second time, and interrogators turned up the heat.
Who shot it? Dante. Who shot it?
Dante Parker was the first one to crack.
He was told that he should try to get on board as soon as he could so that he could get the best deal possible for his cooperation and not wait to be the last guy who helped the police out.
Parker, who was interrogated for hours without sleep, eventually confessed.
First I hit the old lady. She was on the ground.
Parker said he witnessed the murder of the 71-year-old Buddhist nun and said she was face up on the floor when shot.
Sideways? Face up.
He also claimed the word "bloods" was written on the wall in the victim's blood. The next day, Mark Nunez also confessed.
All right. I was there.
They interrogated him for hours. Nunez was certainly a kind of a mama's boy. You know, was in tears most of the time. Just absolutely terrified.
I was one of the killers.
After that, it was Leo Bruce's turn. He had been kept awake for 33 straight hours. He too confessed.
The sheriff's department had convinced him that the only way he could avoid the gas chamber was to confess, and that if he would confess, that the sheriff's department would assist him in staying out of the gas chamber.
I put the trigger. I kill all 9 people.
Police now had 4 men who confessed to the Buddhist monk massacre.
I had nothing to do with this. I have no idea what.
The last man, identified by Mike McGraw as an accomplice, Victor Zarate, refused to confess. In the bedroom of Zarate's home, police found this jade Buddha figurine. A temple member identified it as belonging to Pirak Canton, one of the monks killed in the massacre. Victor Zarate not only denied he was involved, but said he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was working at a racetrack that night, and a security camera videotape proved it. Later, the temple member who said she saw this figurine in the temple admitted she was mistaken.
As it turned out, they had the wrong figurine, the wrong religion. They couldn't even get that right.
So Victor Zarate was set free. The other men who confessed became known as the Tucson Four.
At the time, it was, clear that they stated that they were involved in those particular murders.
Mike McGraw said the shooters' bloody clothes were discarded along Interstate 10 as they drove back to Tucson. Sheriff's deputies searched all 100 miles of the highway using helicopters, horses, and all-terrain vehicles. But they never found the bloody clothes. And deputies still didn't have the .22 caliber Marlin rifle used in the murders, so they asked each of the suspects about guns they owned. Leo Bruce, who previously admitted being the trigger man, said the magic words.
As he's sitting there, he's asked whether or not he owns a .22 Marlin rifle, and he says, "Yes, I do." And they say, "Well, that's what was used to murder these 9 individuals."
His rifle was taken to the forensics lab for analysis.
We know from experimentation, we know from our research, that no 2 guns will leave the same identical markings on bullets and cartridge cases.
As a bullet travels through the barrel of the gun, it is marked by the various lands and grooves inside of the barrel, and every bullet fired from that gun will be marked in the same way. Morris test-fired Bruce's Marlin and compared the lands and grooves from that bullet to those removed from the murder victims. In a major step backwards for the prosecution, the ballistic test showed conclusively that Leo Bruce's gun was not the murder weapon. Since they needed some physical evidence against the confessed killers, they turned their attention to the footwear impressions found at the crime scene. Several dozen pairs of shoes and boots belonging to the Tucson Four were seized by sheriff's deputies and sent to the forensics lab for analysis. James Serpa photographed, then compared the soles of the suspect's shoes to the crime scene photographs.
I was able to exclude all of those shoes as having produced any of the impressions that were found in or around the temple.
The suspect's shoes did not match, and Leo Bruce's gun didn't match. and investigators were in for another surprise. 2 of the 4 men who confessed recanted their confessions. And these 2 men made charges of their own about what happened to them inside the interrogation room at the time of their confessions. Investigators were shocked to learn that the rifle owned by confessed killer Leo Bruce was not the murder weapon. Investigators had no choice but to take a second look at the confessions. Was it possible that in their initial excitement over these confessions, members of the Sheriff's Department overlooked an obvious problem? Much of the information in the confessions was inaccurate. For example, Mike McGraw, the mental patient, incorrectly identified the types of guns used.
He had the murder weapons being Glocks and 9mm and shotguns and assault rifles and deer rifles, all kinds of weapons that were not actually used in this horrible crime.
Was she face up or face down?
Dante Parker said the Buddhist nun was lying face up on the floor, but she was lying face down. He said the word bloods was written on the wall in the victim's blood. That, too, was incorrect. And he said several monks chased him outside after the murders.
Dante mentioned that he saw all these bloody monks running out the door toward the parking lot, toward him, where he was. And of course, investigators knew that couldn't be true because they had all been killed inside the building.
Parker also alleged that investigators threatened to arrest his foster brother if he did not confess. Soon, even the press was questioning whether the Sheriff's Department had rushed to judgment. Prosecutor Rick Romley decided to take an independent look at the confessions and spent a full week reading the transcripts of each one.
I just shut my door, read them at home, read them at work, and I read everything, and it didn't add up. The stories were different. It didn't corroborate one another.
As Romley contemplated whether to go forward with the case against the Tucson Four, forensic analysts were testing yet another rifle police had confiscated. 6 weeks earlier, an alert military policeman on the Luke Air Force Base, Sergeant John Torito, stopped a car for a routine traffic violation. Inside the car, Torito noticed a rifle in the back seat. Sergeant Torito, aware that police were looking for the weapon used in the Temple murders, confiscated the rifle and turned it over to the Sheriff's Department, where it was placed behind an office door and forgotten until someone remembered it 6 weeks later. It was a .22 caliber Marlin, like the one used in the Buddhist murders. Bill Morris performed the ballistics examination. The bullets from the confiscated rifle matched those found at the temple. 17-year-old Rolando Caratachia was driving the vehicle in which the rifle was discovered and was immediately questioned by the Sheriff's Department. Instead of implicating the Tucson Four, Caratachia told investigators a completely different story. Caratachia insisted he had nothing to do with the murders and said he didn't know any members of the Tucson Four. He did say that a few months earlier, he loaned his rifle to 2 17-year-old high school students, Johnathan Doody and Alex Garcia.
Suddenly the case took a 180-degree turn.
The next step was to find out where Doody and Garcia were on the night of the murders. The owner of the weapon used in the murder of 9 Buddhist monks, Rolando Caratachia, was questioned by the Sheriff's Department as a possible suspect.
Just loaned your gun to 217. That's all I did. Okay. I just loaned it to him.
He said he had nothing to do with the crime, but implicated 2 high school students, Johnathan Doody and Alex Garcia, saying he loaned them his rifle around the time of the murders. Doody's father had been stationed at Luke Air Force Base, but when he was transferred, his son Johnathan stayed behind to finish high school, living with his friend, Alex Garcia.
Doody and Garcia, as it turns out, were two 17-year-olds enrolled at Agua Fria High School in Avondale, Arizona, which is not too far from Luke Air Force Base. They were enrolled in the Air Force ROTC program and aspired to military careers.
Johnathan Doody was born in Thailand and had ties to the Wat Prom Kunaram temple. His mother was at one time an active member, and his brother had also been employed there. Detectives searched Alex Garcia's bedroom and found boxes of ammunition, military camouflage gear, stereos and cameras from the temple, and a pair of military-style boots which were sent to the forensics lab for analysis. There, criminalists analyzed the pattern on the soles.
I took the outsole and I applied a light dusting of black fingerprint powder. I then lifted it with a clear adhesive acetate film and then deposited that film onto a clear acetate cover sheet. That allowed me to do an overlay comparison directly onto the impressions that were documented at the crime scene.
After careful analysis, James Serpa discovered 6 accidental characteristics on the suspect's boots. These are tiny flaws made either in the manufacturing process or through wear. The 6 accidental characteristics in the suspect's shoes were identical to the accidental characteristics in the footwear impressions found at the murder scene. In Garcia's home, police also found a Stevens shotgun.
Firing pin impression, in this case, gets stamped into the head of the primer of the shot shell, and it's a very distinctive marking, and it's different from all shotguns, all other shotguns.
The shotgun matched the casings found at the crime scene. When investigators confronted Alex Garcia and Johnathan Doody with this evidence, both confessed to the Buddhist monk murders. Alex Garcia confirmed what many already suspected, that he and Doody acted alone, and that the Tucson Four were innocent.
The attack on the temple was part of a war games exercise that had been hatched by Doody and Garcia to see if they could compromise the security at the temple, commit a robbery, and make a clean getaway.
Doody said they chose the temple because of rumors of gold and riches.
There were stories about some safe, and there was in fact a large safe in the dining room, but the stories abounded about all the wealth and jewelry and gold that the Buddhists had in their temple, which they didn't have. But to these kids, it was something worth going after.
Garcia told investigators that on August 9th, as night fell over the temple, he and Doody put on battle dress uniforms, snow boots, scarves, and glasses to hide their faces. He said the motive was robbery. They forced the monks into the living room, ordered them onto their knees, and told them to put their hands behind their heads. Then, Doody panicked. He was afraid one of the monks might recognize him since his brother had once worked there, and they both started shooting.
They didn't try and get up. They didn't try to run. I'm not sure if they all knew what was actually going on.
After the murders, the two stole $2,600 in cash and some stereo and camera equipment. Garcia also cleared up another mystery.
He had carved the word "bloods" in the wall as an afterthought to throw us off. The red herring, the proverbial red herring.
Some members of the sheriff's department still believe that the Tucson Four were somehow involved in these murders.
They said, "Rick, just leave him in jail. We'll get the evidence." And that's when I broke a little bit, and I slammed my hand on the table, and I said, that's not what we're about. We in America don't keep people in jail hoping to get evidence.
19-year-old Mark Nunez was the first of the 4 ex-suspects to emerge following the dismissal of charges this morning.
3 months after the murders, the Tucson Four were freed. All charges against them were dropped. But why would 4 men confess to a crime they didn't commit, especially when facing the possibility of the death penalty? One possible reason for the false confessions was that the suspects were taken into what was called the prop room before their interrogations, where they saw crime scene photos and what looked to be confidential files.
The police justified having this prop room by saying, we wanted to show these killers that that we knew everything they did. They were essentially educated about how the crime occurred, and so they fed back some of those details in their confession, and of course some of the stories matched.
Lady, she was on the ground.
And a prop room is a ruse. It's a trick. It's a way to get a potential suspect to believe that you have information that you really don't have.
Also in the prop room were phony folders with the suspects' names on them, filled with official-looking documents. And there was some theater involved. The suspects were led to believe that allowing them into that room was a huge mistake.
And then a commander come in and say, what the heck is this person doing here? Get him out of here, he's seen too much.
Seeing the crime scene photographs had a devastating effect on the suspects, especially Leo Bruce.
Never seen a dead body. He'd certainly never seen anybody that was murdered. You can imagine what that must have looked like to a young man who had never been involved in any criminal activity whatsoever. It scared him. He was terrified.
Some experts say that law enforcement in Phoenix was under so much pressure to solve the crime, they may have lost their objectivity.
They were so locked into the belief, A, that these people had to be guilty, and B, no matter how psychologically rough or for how psychologically long or what techniques you use, innocent people don't falsely confess, and therefore these people will not falsely confess. It was their ignorance combined with their overzealousness in this case that surprised me.
The question still troubling police was how Mike McGraw, the mental patient, knew about the word bloods carved in the temple wall. It was all a misunderstanding.
Crazy Mike had said during one of the interviews, was there blood on the wall? And by the time it gets back to the headquarters, what it is perceived that he is saying is the word bloods is written on the wall.
In 1994, Johnathan Doody was tried and convicted for his role in the Buddhist temple massacre and sentenced to 281 years in prison. Before Alex Garcia was sentenced, he revealed one last piece of news, some information about another murder. Shortly after the Buddhist temple massacre, at a lakeside campsite in northern Arizona, Alice Marie Cameron was shot and killed while being robbed of $20. George Peterson, a transient with a history of mental illness, was a suspect in that case. Peterson was questioned for 14 hours before he confessed to killing Alice Cameron and was charged with first-degree murder. But Alex Garcia said he was the one who murdered Alice Cameron and that George Peterson was innocent.
It was probably the most important piece to convince law enforcement that we needed to revisit the way we were doing business, because this was not just an isolated instance.
For his part in these two crimes, Alex Garcia was convicted and sentenced to 271 years in prison.
You did it.
3 members of the Tucson Four accused their interrogators of making threats, depriving them of food, rest, and access to telephones to speak with their attorneys. They sued Maricopa County and received a $2.8 million settlement. George Peterson also sued the county and received a $1.1 million settlement. Citizens of Phoenix lost confidence.
I think the public trust was significantly damaged. I think the sheriff's office became a laughingstock for a while.
Today, the Wat Prom Cunaram Temple continues to serve Phoenix's Buddhist community. In the garden, behind the temple, is a memorial to the 9 kind, peace-loving individuals who were slaughtered one night because 2 17-year-old boys decided to play a war game. It also stands as a reminder that the journey to truth and justice isn't always a straight path. There's a need for objectivity,